Hi, my name is Michael William Doyle. I am interviewing Provost Emeritus Warren VanderHill at Ball State University on today's date, Friday, the 18th of January 2019. This is for the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project. We're very deeply grateful for your time, Warren. For the past year, you've been serving in an unofficial capacity as an advisor to this project. Once we decided to do it, I remember it was New Year's Eve of 2017, I saw you at a function and mentioned this to you, and you immediately began naming names of, well, you got to talk to so-and-so, you got to talk to so-and-so, but you readily grasped the goal of our project, which is Ball State lacks a comprehensive written history of the Honors College. The closest we have are Tony and Bruce's Ball State University and Interpretive History that covers the university's history up through the year 2000. And one of your former students in the Honors College, John Lee, who did an honors thesis that covered the first 3 decades since the program's founding in 1959. Bruce Gielhood then also did his History of the Honors House with one of his former students. And so there were bits and pieces that have made it into the written historical record. But much of the history of the university's Honors College, formerly Honors Program, exists in the archives and primary sources and in the memories of those who were present at the creation and who helped nurture it from its inception to what it is today. The goal of our project is to bring 30-some individuals who were instrumental in the Honors College's early years, either as administrators or faculty or staff. We're also speaking with different cohorts of students, now alums of the Honors Program, Honors College, and then some current faculty, staff, and administrators and students. So when we're all done, we're hoping to have a much more nuanced view of the Honors College as it grew and developed over time. And it's my understanding that you are probably the person who knows the most about the program over the past 6 decades, and you've had a central role in many of the developments over recent decades. I'd like to begin by asking you about yourself. Where and when were you born?
I was born in upstate New York, in Nyack, New York, near the Tappan Zee Bridge that I always tell people for a point of identification. My father was a Dutch Reformed minister in the Reformed Church in America, and at that time he was serving a church that you can still see now from the Thruway, the Clarkstown Reformed Church. He then, during the World War II years, moved to New Brunswick, New Jersey, and served the church there, and did a lot of pastoral work at Camp Kilmer, which is now part of Rutgers University campus, and then moved shortly after the end of World War II to the borough of Queens, and took up a fairly large, vibrant congregation, kind of right in the middle of the borough of Queens, and the postal designation being Queens Village. And so my roots really, as far as my eastern part, is the Queens part of New York City. Now I always hesitate when I say that because my mother and father are both from southwestern Michigan, from the Dutch belt of southwestern Michigan, the home of Dutch immigration Calvinism, which had a lot to do with my own personal research interests. And so I grew up in a kind of interesting way because I would spend 11 months in New York City, and then my father, who had a months-long vacation, would try as best he could with some old flivver car, pre-interstates and Pennsylvania turnpikes, to get back out to southwest Michigan, where we'd spend time with my grandparents in Grand Haven, Michigan, and my parents on my dad's side in Holland, Michigan. And so that was my re-immersion every year, me and my younger brother, 4 years younger than I am, back into traditional Dutch Calvinism. And so here I was in the ethnic melting pot of the borough of Queens, where I used to refer to myself as a minority Protestant, because most of my friends were ethnic Roman Catholic, Italian, German, Irish, or Jewish. And I learned an awful lot about what it meant to be part of a place like the borough of Queens at that time in the 1950s in particular. But then going back to Michigan, I was really re-immersed in this Dutch Calvinist culture where you went to church on Sunday morning, went to church on Sunday evening, maybe went to a prayer meeting on Wednesday night. And of course, all my relatives were very conservative Dutch Calvinists out there.
Evidently, your father was a college educated.
Right.
Was your mother as well?
No, my mother was one of 4 sisters whose father owned a grocery store in Grand Haven, Michigan. And that's a whole nother story because he is a very good example of somebody who, along with his partner, had a grocery store, meat market, pretty much one that all the people in Grand Haven, Michigan went to. And he was basically, to be really blunt with you, driven out of business by the coming of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. And so he died the year I was born, which has something to do with me because you get to see Warren VanderHill, Charles Warren VanderHill stuff. And I was named for my grandfather, Charles Fisher, and my grandmother, her be now all of a sudden a widow at that point. I never knew my grandfather. Didn't want the name Charles used around. And so I became Warren, even though I was named after my grandfather. But I mean, he was really someone that introduced me to a family where he had 4 daughters. My mother was the oldest. And interestingly enough, it turned out that she was the only one that didn't go to college. And the reason she didn't go to college is because he lost his business and really became what we'd probably call today a manic depressive or bipolar. As I said, died at a fairly young age. And my mother scratched together enough money to go to what is now Ferris State University. It was then Ferris Institute, and took some secretarial courses. And so my father, living in Holland, Michigan, working in the home of a Dutch Calvinist spindle carver, a very well-known woodworker, who worked for a very well-known furniture company called Baker Furniture that still makes very fine furniture today. He was the boy of 3 in the family, 2 girls, but he was the one who was going to go to college. And because he was in Holland, Michigan, he went to Hope College because that's where Hope College was. And so it wasn't that he had 5 choices. You know, it wasn't Harvard, Princeton, Yale, or Hope. I mean, if you're going to go to college and you lived in the 1920s in Holland, Michigan, that's where you went. And that was the college of his church. And so it was appropriate that he went there. And then met my mother, going back to the secretarial bit, because she came to Holland to work for a person who was a relative of her mother's, who was starting a large insurance business. There's all kind of subtext to this. Somebody who became very wealthy, actually, because he insured the beginning of large motor express companies, like still see them on the road today, Holland Motor Express. That's the beginning of that. And he was the insurer of that company, among other things. And he brought my mom to Holland to be his personal secretary. So hence they're in Holland. She's from Grand Haven, which is about 20 miles up the road on Lake Michigan. They met, they get married, the beginning.
Did you have siblings growing up?
I have a younger brother who's 4 years younger.
His name?
His name is Jim. He is retired General Motors executive, lives in Virginia Beach. And so we are 4 years apart. And even though we were both very successful basketball players in New York City, both ended up going to Hope College.
I don't believe I asked you the date of your birth.
September 20, 1937.
And you were born in Queens Village?
I was born in West Nyack.
Oh, West Nyack, excuse me, you said that. Okay.
Yeah, Nyack Hospital.
How would you characterize your childhood? You've alluded to the fact that you spent 1 month in Michigan, the rest in Queens.
No, that's a good question. I mean, because I still keep in touch with people I grew up with in what I call the playgrounds of New York City. I mean, my identification of myself, which is quite interesting for someone who ended up being provost of a large Midwestern university, was really that I was much, much more of an athlete than I was a student, and really wasn't a very good student. Even I went to a quite fancy Episcopal prep school. I joke these days that one of my classmates was Donald Trump's older brother, so I always make sure I get that in.
The one who committed suicide or drank himself to death.
Yeah, Fred, who was the manager of our basketball team and the goalie on our soccer team. So he was a pretty good friend at that point in time. But it was more being around, as I look back now, a variety of people who were just emerging into the middle class, ethnic, part of New York City, moving out to Queens from Brooklyn and Manhattan, to some degree the Bronx. Many of them buying their first homes, but in the case of a lot of the Italian kids, still having Italian grandmothers in the home and speaking Italian. The Irish kids had fathers who were on the police force or were firefighters, traditional occupations for a lot of people at that point in time. But for me, I look back, and my brother and I often talk about this, it was an amazing education because by vivid contrast with our Calvinist cousins out in Michigan, we really learned an awful lot about what Catholic families were in New York City, what both Reform and some Orthodox Jewish families were like in New York City. And so, as I said a few moments ago, referring to myself as a minority Protestant, it was more that I learned to appreciate a lot of other cultures, and I learned to appreciate how a lot of other households came into being and what the patriarchy and the matriarchy of those households were. I mean, one person I was corresponding with this morning, who ended up retiring as an executive in Cleveland, was from an Irish Catholic family with 8 kids. He then had 8 kids. And, you know, it's to go back and forth with him as some of the people who were part of this playground where we all played basketball and various other sports, but primarily basketball, is really to go back in kind of a time warp and discover what all these students, or I should say kids, because they were students in that their parents, almost to a person, had not gone to college. And what enabled these kids to do is to get basketball scholarships and go to college. And then, of course, the thing to do was to go to St. John's or NYU or LIU or Queens College or Hofstra. It wasn't until the late 1950s that the basketball players that I knew, the good ones in New York City, made this incredibly abrupt break and went south and started playing at places like North Carolina and Duke and schools like that. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that was my background. So if you said to me, well, you know, your 5 best friends read which 10 books, I have no idea. But I could tell you who the best basketball players were and where they went to college and what they did later in their lives, although now it's, sadly, in the last couple of years, a few of them have passed on. So we're getting to the point now where these are people who were in their late 70s and early 80s.
Mm-hmm. Your draw for participating in athletics, was that unique in your family? You mentioned, I think that your brother
it's my father. My father was a really gifted athlete and probably was right on the fringe of being good enough to be a professional center fielder in baseball. Baseball was his best sport, although at Hope he was both the captain of the baseball team and the basketball team. And so for me to later end up going there after a brief stop at the University of Maryland and to play basketball at Hope, and then my brother who decided, well, you know, I think I'll turn down these Division I scholarships and I'll go to Hope too because they're pretty good and my brother's there. So we played 1 year together. I was a senior when he was a freshman. But before that, it had been my father who had been, you're Vern VanderHill's son, and he was a great player here in the 1920s. So there's that kind of memoryscape to that.
Mm-hmm. I always envision kids back in that era playing stickball in the street, pick up basketball in empty lots and things on that order, what parks there were around.
Yeah.
Did you also participate in league play in your high school years?
Yeah, St. Paul's. I mean, the funny thing with me is here I end up going as a day student to this really wonderful, now closed, Episcopal prep school in Garden City, Long Island, where 90% of the students there were boarders and 10% of the students were day students. And we rode the Long Island Railroad every day to go to school. And so I'd get my railroad pass and go out to Garden City every day. And had to be there, by 8 o'clock in the morning because we had chapel every day in the Episcopal chapel there. I digress and say maybe the only person you've ever met who's taken a whole year studying the Book of Common Prayer, whose father was a Calvinist minister. That is truly atypical. But I went to St. Paul's to some degree because in the area where I lived, there was no public high school. I would have had to take the bus and go the other way back into New York City and go to Jamaica High School, also now closed. Most of the people I refer to went to parochial high schools or they went to Jamaica. In my case, my father had a good friend who was the Episcopal rector in the area where we lived. And he said, well, you know, Vern, I can get your son the clergy discount. And so I went to St. Paul's as a day student for about 20% of what these kids paid who went there, whose fathers were, shall we say, more of the economic elite, like the Trumps.
Fred Sr.
Yeah, I mean, it was, if I'd known that Fred at that point was probably worth $10 million, I would have been a better friend. But obviously at that point we didn't have any idea, except we knew his father was very successful. But almost all the kids there had fathers who were very successful, so that wasn't all that unusual. So that's the part that's my father. So I mean, following in his footsteps to go to Hope College eventually was, well, your dad did that and now you're doing that. The other point I should tell you, which is important to this story, is that the church my father had in New York City was quite a large church, and it had a gym. And I was always very popular with my friends because when the weather would be like it is now, it was, say, Warren, can your dad get the keys to the gym? And so the gym where, the church gym at Queens Reformed Church in Queens Village, New York, became kind of a community center. And so all these friends of mine would just say, is it okay if you're, Catholic guys, Jewish guys, we don't care. Can we go over and play basketball all day Saturday or something like that in your quote, your dad's gym? I said, well, sure, we can do that. So that was part of my growing up. Say, well, did you play in the park? I said, yeah, I was a park player, but I had my own gym. So it was a little bit unusual.
Did you have a consciousness of yourself back in those days as being a minority within a minority neighborhood, community, prior to when you went to St. Paul's?
Yeah, because at that time, the New York City Public Schools had something called release time. And if you were in a public school, which I was until I went to St. Paul's for my freshman year after 8th grade at public school, if you were a Protestant or a Catholic or Jewish, on Wednesday afternoon, the New York Public Schools let you go to your church, imagine that, and study something. So the Catholic kids who were not at the Catholic grade school, they would go there for Catholic catechism and things like that. Jewish kids would go to the temple and study Torah or something like that. And we would go to the Reformed church, or you could go to the Lutheran church or the Presbyterian church or the Methodist church, and you had release time on Wednesday afternoon. So that's part of what made you very cognizant of your other friends and where they were going. I mean, it wasn't something you spent a lot of time talking about. You just knew there was a differentness, because in the case of the Catholic kids, they went to parochial school, and so they were around playing basketball, but they weren't in the same school. The Jewish kids were.
Would you have considered yourself devout?
I don't think, not really. I think that we were believers, certainly, but if you would ask me at that point in time to tell you the fine points of Dutch Calvinism, I probably couldn't have done it, kind of like Presbyterians around here. But you were always aware that the church was a central part of your life. And I say that a lot because what that does, it makes the week's focus of a family a Sunday, which is not the case in families that are not part of a ministerial cluster. So everything was focused on the things that a pastor did on Sunday. So you had Sunday school, and you had the church service, and you had maybe some meetings after that or something like that. So where a day of rest for most other people's parents, my friends' parents, that wasn't a day of rest for me. That was a day of really big time activity, which was always followed by a big Sunday noon meal. And so that was the focal point of your week. It wasn't Saturday. Saturday was a funny day for me because I look back now and think that was my father's day of preparation for Sunday. So you did not go to my father's study in our house on Sunday night where he was very busily preparing his sermon and his notes and all the things.
Saturday night.
Pardon?
Saturday night.
Saturday night. Yeah, that was a big night. So it wasn't that you were sitting around watching, if you had a television, which we did a little bit later, a round one, a zenith. So it was, family night was, my father would be upstairs preparing his sermon, then come back downstairs, and we had a little bit of time together. And the other days of the week were a little bit interesting because during the academic year, you were in school. And your father didn't have a schedule like my friends' parents had schedules. And my father would go off to visit the sick in a hospital, or he'd perform a funeral service or something like that. So there was never any specific, you do this on Monday from 8 o'clock until 5 o'clock.
You hear about the son of a preacher man and the association with how the kids are like diametrically the opposite of their more strict fathers. Were you a minister's son in that sense ever?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think there were probably, if you take the concept of son with wild hair, I probably was a bit more like that than my brother. I think that Jim was a little bit more, if he were here, he'd probably say no, but I'll use this anyway, a little more conformist. But I think that in my case, there was maybe a little bit more rebellion. I don't think anything pronounced. I will say, quite frankly, having spent 4 years at a very good Episcopal prep school where everyone went to college and everyone aspired to go to a very good college. And this was the day of college boards first becoming important as far as tests.
What year would this be?
I graduated in 1955. So the early 1950s. So these were kids, all of whose parents had gone to college. Well, not all, but probably about 80%. And their level of aspiration was to go to the best Eastern schools. I mean, they're either the Ivies or the Ivies. And so my friends that I still keep up contact with from that period went to Cornell, Colgate, Hamilton, Williams, Dartmouth. That was the rule of thumb. Colby, Bowdoin, and the ones who probably were not doing so well academically went to Hofstra and Adelphi and places like that. They're good schools, but the highest level of aspiration was something Ivy or near Ivy or Ivy-like. And all of them did that. And many of them, almost all of them went into business. And several went on and got MBAs from Harvard and ended up on Wall Street in the financial, as we call it today, the financial services industry. And that was really what they aspired to be. I mean, I'm the real outlier of that bunch because I wasn't a very good student in high school. I was a basketball player. And so my goal was to get a basketball scholarship. And so I did. I mean, I succeeded. I had probably a 2.5 average in high school academically and had a lot of scholarship offers to go to a lot of very good Division I schools. Ended up going to the University of Maryland. Probably my final 3 schools were Maryland, UConn, and probably Wake Forest or North Carolina State. But I went to Maryland, made a campus visit there. They just built a new field house. They've now built another one. And so people would often say, well, you're going to want to major in history because I kind of like that. Why'd you go to Maryland? Well, they have a history major and they had a nice basketball court. So that seemed like it was an impressive thing to do. So that's the reason that I went there.
Mm-hmm. Did the peers that you mentioned who had these aspirations after St. Paul's sort of look down their noses at you for not having followed the path to the Ivies or near Ivies?
That's a very good question because I many years later, when I had probably just become provost here, I went to a reunion at St. Paul's School. And one of my very good friends, fellow soccer and basketball player who had gone to Cornell, and stayed to do a law degree at Cornell and become a very successful person with Nomura Securities. We're riding out to the reunion on the Long Island Railroad, wanting to replicate our lives, staying in Midtown Manhattan where he lived, got on the railroad, and took the train out to Garden City. And about halfway, I'll never forget this, he turned to me and he said, "When did you discover learning?" and I said, well, that's a very good question because I probably did not discover what we would call learning until I went to Hope. I mean, St. Paul's in some ways was a transformative time in my life, but Hope College certainly was, which is eventually going to get us to the honors approach to doing things. But when I went to Maryland, I realized I was down there a couple of months, great basketball program. But the coach there had played at Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State, for a legendary coach named Henry Iba. And his philosophy of basketball was very slow, methodical basketball. The New York City playground game, because he wanted to get some players from New York City, was running up and down the floor and shooting. This is, of course, before 24-second clocks and things like that. So I got down there and realized what a friend of mine who went to St. John's had told me, And that is, you probably ought not to go there because you're not going to like the way this coach coaches. And I was there for 2 months, then came back to New York City. Got a job at what's now Citicorp, First National Bank, and played basketball for them for a little bit, and then went out to Hope for second semester of that year. Would have been my freshman year at Maryland. I was thinking of transferring to NYU because I'd been offered a scholarship to NYU, and they were still playing in Madison Square Garden. I thought that'd be a lot of fun. And my father said, "No, you're not. You're going out with the Dutch people, and they will look after you." And so I can recall going to Grand Central Station, my father putting me on the train and saying, "Go to Grand Rapids, Michigan, get off train. Your cousin, who's a junior at Hope, will meet you and take you to Holland, Michigan. Goodbye." That was that. And so the transformative influence in my life academically, by far, is going to Hope College, where some of the faculty had been students, a couple even fraternity brothers, one of the eminent political science professors of my dad's. And so it's one of these things where you get into an environment like Hope College, all your relatives are in town. That's nice that you're going to play basketball, but everyone there was a good student. They studied hard. They took academic work very seriously. And the classes were 20, 25 people. I mean, it was a very intense, very focused, within a Dutch Calvinist overlay kind of experience. And so I quickly, shall we say, became part of that melting pot and discovered the thing to do when you're here, the college was then 800, now it's 3,400, was that you studied and you went to the dorm and you went to chapel. And in my case, you played basketball. And so there was a real routine to it, but everyone did the same thing. And though people were having a lot of fun, it being Western Michigan, winter or spring and fall, there still was a focus on you're supposed to go to class. You don't not go to class. Everyone goes to class. Everyone goes to chapel. Everyone goes to the library after basketball practice every night and studies. And that's what my life became. And once that happened, going back to the question that my classmate posed to me on the Long Island Railroad years later, when did you discover learning? That's really where I discovered learning. In high school I did, or at prep school I did, if I liked the class, I did okay. If I didn't, I didn't.
Those who are religious adherents consider themselves disciples, and they aspire to be disciplined. And I'm curious to know how your religious upbringing might have helped you acquire the discipline to be an excellent athlete and later to be an excellent scholar.
Maybe. I mean, I think that that probably was more true from an athletic standpoint. We're pushing down the road here, but you're going to get to a point where later I go to Grand Rapids Community College now, junior college then, and was teaching history and political science before I came down here, and I was the basketball coach. So I had a little bit of experience doing that. And there are those kinds of disciplinary things where I think about, well, yeah, that in my background really helped me to do this. I guess the word I'm looking for here that might apply is structure. And I think that what athletics gave me, and then what the kind of academic work I got into at Hope College gave me, was structure. And that was a very important part of my life. And it's certainly, well, obviously you know this yourself, I mean, it helps you when you're in graduate school or whatever else you're doing, if you have some kind of structure and not just let yourself go off at any end that you want to go to without having any sense of where you're going.
You've alluded to a number of things that you found very stimulating and in your Hope College experience. Right. Are there any other stories that occur to you that might be helpful for us to understand your life history of what happened at Hope? You've alluded to the faculty members. Tell us a little bit more about that experience.
Well, the faculty part of it's really important because, but I also say this is to some degree true of St. Paul's, because the masters at St. Paul's, organized as an Episcopal prep school, there were several of them that as I look back now, they were just exceptionally gifted classroom teachers. And I think of that particularly of a master I had in American history, and one that I had in English, and one that I had in Spanish, all academic areas that interested me. Now, if you were to say, how about the guy who taught physics or math? Not so much. But the ones that I liked, if I liked the course, I did well. When I got to Hope, a lot of the curriculum at a small liberal arts college at that point in time was structured. So you had some general, as we'd call them here, general studies requirements that you had to fulfill. And so I did that. But you didn't have, you'll laugh at this, there was no math requirement. And there was no real what I call hard science requirement. I took kinesiology, but that was just to fulfill that. And you didn't have to take a lot of courses that required calculus. So when people say, well, how'd you do in calculus or plane geometry? Well, in geometry, not so great in prep school, and then didn't take it in college. So it was more migrating toward areas of academic interest, and that's really when probably history, political science, and American literature were the three things that really attracted me.
What attracted you about those disciplines in particular?
Well, my parents were great sort of amateur students of the past. And I was thinking about this the other day, about our interview, and I thought one of the most vivid things I think of, that we took a summer vacation one year and didn't go to Holland and went to upstate New York, and I recall going to Fort Ticonderoga and being immersed in the Green Mountain Boys and the culture of that part of revolutionary New England. And there are just things like that. My mother was great at taking me to museums in New York City, and I really shouldn't have neglected that. And my mother was great, even though she came from the Dutch belt of Michigan, going back to the New Amsterdam days and doing research on the Dutch in New Amsterdam. So there was always that kind of interest on the part of both of my parents in the Dutch coming to America and why they came here. My mother primarily because they were in New York in that period of time, both of them being part of immigrant families, that because of leaving the Netherlands from the 1840s to 1860s, 70s, that's when their families had come over as conservative Dutch Calvinists, part of a wave of immigration where conservative Dutch Calvinists were leaving what they saw as the growing liberalism of the state Reformed Church, the Reformed Church in Holland. So yeah, there's that kind of structure to that.
Do you remember any of the papers that you wrote in the subjects of history or political science back in college that speak to your fascination with particular facets of history or political science?
Oh, oddly enough, my senior, you had to do a senior honors thesis at Hope College, and I still have this paper. I mean, I wrote because of my Jewish friends. This is crazy. It has nothing to do with American history, but we got talking about, of all topics, with a political science professor at Hope College, the concept of proportional representation and whether or not it was a detriment to democracy in Israel. Now I know, never did I revisit that topic, but that was one that really captured my interest, was to look at, it seems really interesting. I should probably take a look at this because my Jewish friends thought that was a big thing. So I did some research in New York City Public Library, on is proportional representation a deterrent to democracy in Israel, and concluded that it was. So I recall that and never again revisited that topic. It's just that I happen to know what that is and what the Knesset is as far as the governing elected body in Israel. The only other one that I ever looked at, you'll laugh at this one too, is I became very interested in the American Bundesführer, Fritz Kuhn, and the German-American Bund, largely because I saw some pictures when I was an undergraduate at Hope of the, I think it's 1939 rally that they had with 20-some thousand people in Madison Square Garden. Yeah, and now it's come up a lot in the context of current times. And then carried that through, and later on in life ended up co-authoring an article with a friend who was eventually on the faculty at one of the Cal State schools in Northern California on Fritz Kuhn and the German-American Bund. So I get into that because there were people that I remember in our neighborhood in Queens Village in New York City who were German immigrants, and I can recall friends of mine saying, well, his father's in the Bund, not knowing that much about the Bund. So there are two examples I can think of that were important in that regard.
You've commented about how you were a minority Protestant in your neighborhood growing up in the New York metro area. Did you have a sense of yourself being a minority at Hope College, given that you came from New York?
No, because see, at that point, this has changed a lot at Hope. Hope's student body has changed markedly because Michigan now has scholarships that are portable. And so large numbers of kids who, I mean, it's not as Dutch as it was. I mean, we both know Bruce Gielhood. Bruce would be an example of someone who went there from Grand Rapids, which is, right smack in the Dutch belt of Western Michigan. At that point in time, probably, I'd guess 20 or 30% of the students at Hope were from the East Coast Dutch churches. And now I'm talking about the churches in New York City, out on Long Island, up the Hudson Valley, the Erie Canal, out the Mohawk Valley. Those are all, as you follow the Dutch settlements of the colonial period, those are old Dutch Reformed churches. And at that point in time, a lot of those kids went to Hope College.
You were also ensconced in a family network.
True. That's and very important. Yeah.
Which then made you something of a native by association, I suppose, in the eyes of some.
No, I think that's definitely true. And in my case, it wasn't that I went to Holland, Michigan, not knowing what Holland, Michigan was or what West Michigan was. So it was very important to have what my parents knew were there after I left the University of Maryland, and that was there was a support base there. And so, okay, for whatever reason, whether it's the coach didn't like fast break basketball offense, you're back. Now you're going to go someplace else to college. Note how that is. You're going to go back to college. There was never any question about that. You should go to someplace which is, to be blunt, safe. And so we know if we put you on this train and you go to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and your cousin meets you at that station in Grand Rapids and drives you to Holland, all will be good with the world. And that actually is what happened. And so, and there, the other part I might as well throw in here is that I met a girl from New York City, from a church in Long Island City, who had gone out there, and she was 2 years ahead of me at Hope, and a very, very good student with incredibly good study habits. And she was probably, as much as any other single individual, the one that said, okay, after basketball practice, we have supper in the dorm, everybody ate together, and then you don't go back to your dorm room, you go to the library. And that's
What is her name?
Carol Mathias. She passed away several years ago.
How do you spell the last name?
Matheis, Carol Mathias.
Did your peers mark you out for any special respect or abuse because you were a preacher's son?
No, because the place was crawling with preachers' sons. I mean, the cousin I referred to, his father was a minister. He's now retired community college president living in Holland, Michigan. No, that was very, very typical. And so a lot of East Coast kids, Midwestern kids, Iowa, with a lot of Reformed churches, were sons of pastors. I mean, I think of the truly great players in Hope College basketball history was a 6'11" center who was the year before me in school, graduated a year before me. And he was an all-state player in Michigan. Father was a minister. He became a minister. His brother became a minister. And those are the kind of people I was around all the time. And so when I think of athletes, let's say football players, basketball players at Hope College, probably 20% of them were preachers' kids, PKs in the quick way of saying it.
You alluded a few moments ago to having encountered an honors education at Hope. Tell me more about that.
That's an important thing. And as we get really into my involvement with honors here and the growth and development of honors at Ball State, it was really a small liberal arts college education with a Calvinist overlay, because you got to take Bible class every year. So you spent 1 year with the Old Testament, 1 year with the New Testament, in addition to doing all the other regular American history, political science, language courses. Foreign language was required for graduation. Traditional liberal arts degree program. But it's important to note that part of that was being in a liberal arts curriculum where you didn't have a bunch of other people who were majoring in 19 other majors. They were all liberal arts majors. If you were interested in business, you majored in econ. We didn't have business administration or anything like that. You could do a teaching degree, and I did enough hours to qualify as a K-12 teacher, but that was all taught as part of this. So you had a couple of people who taught education courses. I was a student teacher in the Holland Public Schools my senior year in American history. I actually won the senior education prize as a senior at graduation. But that wasn't what most people did, except for women. And so the women at Hope were the first group of people I ever met, like my wife, Joy, who went there, she, the first person to go to college in her family, and they were all going to be teachers. And they did that. But for the first time, I met young women who were going to go on and get PhDs in history, in literature. It's the first time I met people who were going to go on and do graduate work in, say, music. And so there was a different population of women there at that time. But they were all taking the same kinds of liberal arts courses in small classes with faculty. You got to know the faculty, they got to know you. And so there was a kind of what I call honors college intimacy to that kind of academic relationship.
Now, Hope College is a college, and the honors program there would be...
There was no honors program, and never has been.
Explain then what it meant, because you said you did a senior honors thesis, did you?
You had to do a senior thesis.
Senior thesis,
yeah,
okay. That was like the equivalent today of the honors thesis here.
Well, that's what's interesting, because when you think of the, I don't want to jump too far ahead here, but when you think of Rich Burkhardt having gone to Knox College in Illinois, which is the same kind of thing as Hope, Vic Lawhead going to DePauw here, same kind of thing, and they all experienced the same sort of academic preparation. But by and large, at small liberal arts colleges, you don't find honors programs. That's why your whole adventure out to Swarthmore in Philadelphia really interests me. That and Bill Adelot, because to have sort of the founding home of honors programs at a school like Swarthmore, it's more you'd think you'd find it at Middle Tennessee State or at Ball State or at Western Michigan or Michigan State. I mean, the Big Ten schools had honors colleges and honors programs, and schools like Ball State did all over the place. But you tended not to find them, and still don't. I mean, Hope College has never had any interest in what we'd call honors education. I mean, there's no honors program at Bowdoin. I mean, that's what you do. Everyone does honors kinds of things. So, not to jump too far ahead on this, it's that at schools like a Ball State Teachers College, which is what Ball State was when honors education came into being here, it was a teachers college. And so to offer these kinds of academic opportunities that Rich Burkhardt had experienced, that Vic Lawhead had experienced, that I had experienced, were the kind of educational opportunities that you had in a small liberal arts college. It really had nothing to do with being called honors this or honors that.
Before we move on to your next educational part of your resume, I'm curious to know a little bit more about Joy, who became your wife. How did you meet? Right. And tell me a little bit about your relationship at the outset.
Well, we met at Hope, and Joy is a total opposite of me, which has been a great relationship. Joy is the first person in the family to go to college. All of Joy's people, if you will, lived in downriver Detroit, communities like Wyandotte, Riverview, Ford Motor Company, big steel companies. Joy's dad ended up being a foreman at Scott Paper Company. Did not graduate from high school. Went on the line at this paper company, worked his way up to become a foreman. So he did make the crossover from the blue collar side to the other side, if you will, before his retirement. Joy's mother is from western Kansas, a little teeny town way over almost near the Colorado border. Came to 1930s, came to Detroit, when a lot of people came to Detroit, and met Joy's dad, got married, 2 daughters. Joy's the youngest of 2. Joy was the first person in her family that ever expressed any interest in going to college. And her parents, who sort of shopped from church to church to church, ended up, when she was at some point in high school, going to one of the outreach churches of the Dutch Reformed Church, which were called community churches, in this case, Southgate Community Church. The pastor there had gone to Hope, Dutch guy, Bud Van Eck. And when Joy got to the point of deciding, I want to go to college, her older sister really didn't have that much interest in it. And so Joy said, well, I want to go to the University of Michigan because, gee, that's the big deal. And Joy had been the drum major of the band and had marched in Michigan Stadium. And so, gee, I want to go to the University of Michigan. And her pastor told her parents, I think that's a very bad idea. I think that she'll get lost there. Her high school was a very small high school. I think she should go to Hope College. That's how Joy got to Hope. And so that's where we met. So her background is blue collar completely. Joy is the one person in our family unit, I'll tell you, who ever worked on an assembly line. So all this labor history stuff that I've done since I retired, Joy knows what it's like. Because her dad was a foreman, she got to be a summer fill-in on the line, working with toilet paper, cut-right wax paper. She knows about Kleenex and wax paper that more than you would ever want to know. And so she knows that side of what life was like. And she was always with the women on the line, as she would call them. And she was doing shift work. And so, she'd do first shift someday, second shift someday, third shift. And getting to know what life was like with the ladies she was working with on the line, who of course all thought she was crazy for wanting to be a teacher because they were making much more money than she was or was going to.
I don't believe you mentioned her maiden name.
Phillip, P-H-I-L-I-P.
Very good.
Joy Phillip.
What do you think she saw in you?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, this is going to sound dopey, but I guess I ought to get it in there anyway. If you think of the classic small liberal arts couple, she was the captain of the cheerleaders eventually, and I was the captain of the basketball team, so fit that in. I mean, Joy was just someone that I met in her first year there, and we started going together shortly after that, had the usual number of ups and downs with her. One year she wasn't going to go back to Hope. She thought she might want to stay in Detroit and work, and that, fortunately she didn't do that. But I was back in the East in all those summers away from college. She was in Detroit, all the back and forth stuff that goes on there. And then so eventually by our junior year, I think we looked down the road. We got married right after we graduated in June of 1960.
Did your parents embrace her, or were they a little skeptical?
Oh, no, they embraced her. And
how about your
yeah, I know what
parents?
you're going to ask. I think, I got on famously with her parents because, my daughter was going to marry a guy who's going to go on and work on a PhD. Not that they really knew what that was, but he, had a fellowship to go to graduate school, was going to go on and work on a PhD. So, yeah, I mean, it was a very good relationship on both sides of the family. I mean,
So there wasn't classes
No.
in which they looked at the college
no,
boy who has these ambitions and...
No, not at all. And particularly for someone like her, maybe more than me and my relatives and friends who went on to college and you were expected to go to college, that's what people did. In Joy's case, they didn't do that. And I can recall going to Thanksgiving feasts with all of her relatives, all these blue-collar guys. And they would make fun of Joy. What do you want to go to college for? All you're going to do is end up getting married, have kids. It's a waste of your dad's money. I remember that. Or a couple uncles saying that.
Did she have in mind that she would pursue a career?
Only in the sense of getting a teaching certificate, because by that point I knew I wanted to go on to graduate school, and she needed something that was portable. And it's a good story because going out to Denver, Colorado, we went to Denver, Colorado in the 1960s because, I mean, there was it's like Hurley Goodall talked about jobs here after World War II. There was a teaching job on every corner out there because Denver at that time was exploding, Denver and surrounding environs. I mean, Joy, every place she interviewed, I tell kids this today and they go, what? Every school system she interviewed, Denver schools, all the suburbs around there, she had 5 interviews and got 5 job offers. You try and tell someone that today. And they were, please come. She taught in a place that no one would have ever heard of had it not been for Columbine. She taught in Littleton, Colorado. So she started out teaching in a trailer as Littleton, Colorado was building elementary schools. And so by the time she finished teaching, we finished my coursework there and went back to the Midwest, she was in an elementary school room where the whole side of it was glass. And on a clear day, you could see Pikes Peak. Now, of course, there's nothing there but suburb, 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 suburb. So I refer to going to Denver when Denver was an overgrown cow town, kind of like Laramie, Wyoming, or some place like that today. But it was an interesting time to go out to Denver, Colorado, because Denver, as a metropolitan entity, was just beginning to get a sense of it as we are Denver. We're one of the great cities of the Rocky Mountain West. So there was this huge period of boom and development. Since then, of course, you've had probably 3 cycles of boom, bust, boom, bust, boom. But that's what Denver was like at that time in the early 60s.
To backtrack just a little bit,
Yeah.
You're in Hope College, you're about to graduate. The two
Right.
of you have decided that you're going to get hitched.
Yeah.
And you've somehow landed on the goal of going to graduate school.
Right.
Were there particular faculty members that encouraged you in this? How did you conceive of the fact
Yeah.
that you would go from having really identified yourself as an athlete,
No, I
different
wasn't that
student,
good.
to becoming somebody who could get into a good graduate
Yeah.
program?
Well, I had a lot of success as a basketball player, but I knew enough about my friends back in New York City who were not NBA basketball players. In fact, one of the guys I knew there who had played for St. John's, was an All-American there. I mean, he went to try out for the St. Louis Hawks when the Hawks were in St. Louis and didn't make the team. And he was a little quicker than I was, and I realized, well, this isn't going anywhere as far as professional athletics. So what you had were the role models of your teachers, your professors at Hope College, and what they had done. And so one of my best professors in American history,
Name?
pardon me?
By name of?
Oh, John Visser, who passed away several years ago, ended up as the president of Kansas State at Emporia, was in graduate school with Dwight Hoover and Mort Rosenberg at Iowa. He was from Iowa and did a PhD in American history at Iowa, and then went into college administration and was down here for a while. That's part of my coming here, because he was Jack Emmons' administrative assistant, and then became the president of the community college in Grand Rapids. So 2 of the first jobs I got were because of him. But he was a real role model. Been a great basketball player at Hope, and then got a PhD in American history, and was doing academic things. And so I said, well, that seems like a good life. Okay, well, what you should do is apply for fellowships. Now, this is one of the great miracle stories of all time. So I applied for what were then called NDEA fellowships, National Defense Education Act fellowships, which came into being as the response to Sputnik. And even though the majority of NDEA graduate fellowships were designed for people in the sciences, engineering, catch up with the Russians, they threw a few bones to American studies and areas like that. And so a lot of schools, like the University of Denver, that were really getting very ambitious about graduate programs, decided, aha, here's our chance to get a lot of federal money, and we'll get a bunch of people from places like, Eastern schools or Midwestern schools like Hope College and bring them out here and do graduate degrees and use the money to hire a bunch of really good, young, Ivy League prepared faculty, which they did. So I applied for an NDEA fellowship at the University of Denver. And when again, trying to explain this to people, I paid nothing to get a PhD. And Joy, even though she was teaching full-time in Littleton, was still a dependent, and they gave me $800 for her. You didn't pay any tax on this, no tuition, no fees, no nothing. So the only thing we did at Denver, Colorado, was pay for married housing. That was it. And those lasted, as you no doubt are aware, as a fellow American historian, until they died in the Vietnam War, and the fellowships all went away. But for about a decade, you had a whole bunch of people who had NDEA fellowships. Paul Mitchell, who was one of my friends in graduate school, a late and dear friend, he was an NDEA fellow at the University of Denver from Knox College, a year ahead of me at the University of Denver. So here were people that I say had this kind of charmed life where, I had to do an assistantship, I had to work, I had to have fellowship. No, you didn't. You just came there, and the only responsibility you had was go to school, was to go to class. That was it. And you think of, where are those fellowships now? Well, they aren't. That's the point. And so it's this small little point in time where, because of schools like Denver wanting to begin a lot of graduate programs in areas like American Studies, that people like Warren VanderHill and Paul Mitchell and a host of others I can name who are pretty well-known American historians, that's how they got through graduate school.
There was an explosion in American higher education because of the baby boom generation and the investment by the United States with the GI Bill and human capital formation after World War II. You weren't a baby boomer,
No.
but you were actually in graduate school during the ferment of the 1960s era.
Not in graduate school. By the time much of that occurred, I was out teaching.
Okay.
So, because if I get into the question of the draft, and so I just found all my draft cards the other day. They were all 3 S's because I was married and then I had a family. So, I recall going to the Brooklyn, New York draft board to sign up for the draft, and the coach at Maryland, because he was going to make sure I went to the right draft board, and so that's an important part of my life of going to the Brooklyn draft board. My only deferments I had were really deferments from the Korean War. And I think of that here because I have faculty colleagues, of course now long retired, who were in some pretty heavy combat in Korea. And so that's my thinking of that period of time. But yeah, later we'll get to the faculty member at Hope College coming down here and that aspect of life in academia.
I have had an American Studies education partly,
Right.
and I taught the American Studies course that used to be on our books at the history department here at Ball State. What I'm struck by is how impervious to knowledge about American Studies other academics, including U.S. historians, are. Mm-hmm. How was it that you would have known, coming out of Hope College, that there was such a thing as American Studies instead of American history? That would have been the more logical degree to program.
Only that I had taken some courses in American literature that I really enjoyed in the English department at Hope. And Denver had set this program up to be sure to get federal funding, to not ask for just an American history program. There are lots of those. So they created it as American Studies. And then hired some very good faculty, most notably Michael McGiffert, who had a long career as the editor of the William and Mary Quarterly. But they brought people like Mike McGiffert in from Yale to really give a kind of Yale American Studies overview to this. And so as part of the graduate program at the University of Denver, you had to have something other than just American history classes.
I see.
And so we took American art history, we took American literature. So it wasn't just a solid core history, straight down the line doctoral program.
I'm interested if the experience of having grown up in the New York metro area and being exposed to the sociological mix of ethnicities and racial and ethnic backgrounds may have, in effect, help you get an innate sense of comparative frameworks within this thing called America that might have then informed why you brought an American Studies perspective to your teaching and research that resulted from your graduate work.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's, again, because of my interest in my own family history, immigration history, which is what I taught for many years when I started out, and Dutch Calvinism in Southwest Michigan, and even in a larger sense in the country, but more specifically Southwest Michigan, but also what you have referred to as my contact, as I said, still to this day, with a lot of people who were the ethnic pals of mine whose backgrounds were Jewish, Irish, German, Italian, Catholic. And I think that gave me an appreciation for something that if you had spent your whole life growing up as a lot of these kids that I began to become friends with when I went out to Hope, solely in Southwest Dutch Holland, Michigan, you had no idea there was that world. I mean, that world to my friends was totally foreign. I mean, one of my closest friends on Hope's great basketball teams was a player who ended up as a senior vice president at State Farm over in Illinois. And I could remember being in a motel, I don't know where we were playing, might have been playing Ball State, I'm really not sure. And he saw on a television screen American Bandstand. And he could not believe that there could be a place in the world where Dick Clark and kids were, dancing like that. It's got a good beat, I'll give it a 90. Yeah. And I said to, his name is Whitey Biernick, I said, well, that's how kids dance back home. It's like Dirty Dancing. And he said, they do? Well, he's from this little conservative farm town in northern Iowa. They didn't dance. They didn't play cards. They didn't go to the movies. They didn't do any of those kind of things. And he just sat there enthralled as we're ready to go out and get on the bus and go play basketball. And somebody says, I can't believe there's a place like that. Well, okay, that's American studies. And there are those kinds of things that I think drew me to take, shall we say, a broader perspective than just a strict historical approach to a subject.
Tell me about some of the faculty that were especially memorable in your graduate training at Denver.
Well, Mike McGiffert sure was. Mostly because, I don't know how much you know about Mike McGiffert, but his father had been Union Theological Seminary. He was one of the great scholars on American Puritanism. So he came at his Calvinism a little bit differently than I did. And he was an academic, like a lot of people I'd go into prep school with. And he was a real East Coast elitist. His wife was an opera singer. He was very unusual couple. And he came there, he came out to Denver, I think, like he had the Grail, and he was going to come out there and bring Eastern New England Puritan learning to the Rocky Mountain Empire. And he approached his classes that way. A real taskmaster. You should be reading these things with the Puritan view in mind. And so it was a very close reading, shall we say, of a lot of stuff that you were doing in American colonial history, particularly Puritan stuff, and research that he had done. But he was one. But then there were others, like my graduate mentor that I ended up with was a man named Harold Dunham. And Harold Dunham had gone to Columbia, where he was a close friend of Allen Nevin's. And he is somebody who was in the service and had been an officer, I think pretty high up, and gone out to Denver as kind of a wave of Columbia-educated academics, but hardly had the New England snobbishness of a Michael McGiffert. And so, we were kind of kindred spirits, and he was the major professor on my doctoral thesis, and became very good friends. But you had someone like that, McGiffert on one hand, another person young. McGiffert was very young. Professor Dunham was probably in his 50s at that time. But they brought in this young hot shot from here, from Indiana, who had done a dissertation on the first Hague Peace Conference and won the Beveridge Prize. And so all his fellow, whose name is Cal Davis, who died a couple of years ago, as did Mike McGiffert. But Cal Davis was out there as a young, upwardly mobile faculty member. Mike McGiffert was there as a young, upwardly mobile faculty member. And so you had a good combination of people who were senior faculty who had done very interesting things and ended up at the University of Denver and wanted to get involved in this doctoral program. Then you had people like these up-and-comers that they'd gone off and said, here's a lot of money, you can come out here, this will be your first job. And you can, Davis ended up with a long career at Duke, and Mike McGiffert ended up with this long career at William & Mary and editor of William & Mary Quarterly. So you had a combination of the young old on that was really a great group of graduate faculty. I mean, this has nothing to do with my program specifically, but one of the faculty there, faculty member in Far Eastern history, was a guy named Alfred Crofts, who'd written the textbook on history of the Far East. And he had been on MacArthur's staff in World War II. I mean, he knew everybody. He was fluent in Japanese. And so it was an interesting combination of people. So going back to your point about role models, this place was chock full of role models. The department head, I got to get this in here, was a man named Alan Breck, who was part of the Breck shampoo fortune and ended up as a very well-known academic. He might have been a Rhodes Scholar, I'm not really sure, but he was a department head and a real entrepreneur. And he was one of these people who saw with this national defense money, he could build up a really big history department and then use this money to bring people out there. Like, the people who came there were people like me from Hope College, Paul Mitchell from Duke, Paul Holsinger from Duke, Paul Mitchell from Knox, Bob Fogarty, who was the editor of the Antioch Quarterly from Fordham, Bill Marina, who set up the history department at Florida Atlantic University from Miami. So there were kids from all over the place. And so what these NDEA fellowships did was enable this guy to build up this department. It's funny thing what you can do with money if you have it at your disposal.
What did you end up doing your doctoral dissertation on?
I did my doctoral dissertation on the probably best known late 19th, early 20th century political leader in the Dutch community of Holland, a man named Gerrit Diekema, D-I-E-K-E-M-A. He was interesting because he was the son of immigrants, became a very, very well-known lawyer, got in with the founding of the Dupre Chemical Company, made a lot of money on that. But the story is a wonderfully romantic one because he ended up as the American ambassador to the Netherlands under Hoover and died there. And so when you think of somebody whose origins, or a young kid coming over on the boat as an immigrant, goes to the University of Michigan, went to Hope, then went to Michigan Law School, and was very successful both in his law practice and his business practice, and then became a congressman in the period from 1910 to about 1914, and then had enough connections in the Republican Party to end up as the American representative at The Hague. So that, it's a wonderfully romantic story. And the fortunate thing is his second wife was still alive when I was still doing this, as was his son, who was then the president of this chemical company. Mm-hmm. So it's a story of immigrant development and success from a very Calvinist, conservative, Republican standpoint.
Did you do a separate master's thesis as well?
Yeah, I did. I did a master's thesis that I'm proud to say won a big award out in Denver. I wrote a master's thesis editing the papers of a frontier justice named Kirby Benedict. And Harold Dunham, that I mentioned a moment or two ago, had gotten a hold of his papers, his personal papers. And so why don't you do an edition of Benedict's papers? Benedict was a circuit rider in the New Mexico territory, what's now New Mexico and Arizona, and came out there, a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, to administer justice after the Civil War. And he had just an amazing career. And so I did an edition of those papers, and there's a big organization out in Denver called the Denver Westerners that give out prizes for Western scholarship. And here I was, a first-year master's student, and I won their prize for the best academic the academic submission for that year, which had been 1961 or 1962, I guess. So that was that.
So you're completing your graduate work.
Right.
You have children by
No.
this time? No, okay.
No.
Joy is still teaching?
Joy's teaching in Littleton.
Okay.
And then becomes pregnant. And that's the change. And so I decide, not sure I want to stay here anymore. And that gets into this part of it, because at that point, John Visser, mentor as an undergraduate, was then Jack Emmons's administrative assistant in the ad building, right as we look across here at Ball State University. And at that, I'll go back a step. He was at that point, he was the president of Grand Rapids Junior College. I got to get this right. I'm off by one jump here. So I met John Visser at a conference of community college administrators in Denver, the downtown Hilton. And he said, well, what are you going to do now? And I said, well, I don't know. I think I'd like to get a job. But you're going to die when I tell you how I got all these jobs. I said, oh, do you have any openings? He said, well, we'll take care of that. And so he said, why don't you come to Grand Rapids Junior College next year, and you could be the assistant basketball coach. Because I think you might want to try that out. Without telling the head coach, I might add. That didn't work too well. And you can teach political science and American history. I said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So I went to Grand Rapids. And I was going to begin doing research on my doctoral dissertation anyway. I had finished my coursework, but hadn't taken my doctoral exam, so I still had those to do, my writtens and orals. So I was ABD at that point, went to Grand Rapids, coached basketball. I don't know how I did this. There weren't that many hours in the day. Taught 15 hours, 5 classes. Coached cross country, because they had no cross country coach by the time I got there. Oddly enough, I digress and tell you, I had a kid on my cross country team who was the #1 runner in the country. I didn't really know anything about cross country, but he was the #1 runner in the country. I'll never forget this kid. His name was Jim Kidder. He was from a little suburb not a suburb now, outside of Grand Rapids. And his motto in life was, pain is the purifier. I've never forgotten that. But he's this runner who, you always can run another mile. And I said, what do you mean? And he looked at me and he said, well, Coach VanderHill, pain is the purifier. Okay, that sounded good. And he won the national championship that year in cross-country running. Went off and got a scholarship to Michigan. So I stayed there I took my written exams there. They had one of the professors there proctor the exams. So I passed my writtens, went back to Denver, did my orals.
What year would that have been?
Oh, it's probably 64, 65, something like that. I mean, it all blends into the vast morass of the past. Mm-hmm. But at that point, our son was born, John, 63. And so I said, okay, I don't want to spend my whole life doing this, which is coaching basketball and being at this community college. Well, it was a great place to be and a great place to live. And I should, again, digress and tell you that I also signed a union contract because they'd unionized all those community colleges the year before, and it was one of the best union contracts you'd ever see. They had first dollar health care. Now, think about that for a while. They drafted onto a bunch of the UAW contracts. I mean, that was the best contract I've ever seen. And so they had decent salaries. I'll never forget the poli-sci professor coming into a meeting of the faculty and saying, now, get these numbers. Okay, you can either have a 14% salary increase, or you can have a 10% salary increase and have fully paid health care. It's 1963. And they all wanted to take the salary increase. And so the guy's name was Nick Feringa, never forgot this. And he said, no, you don't. What you want is a 10% salary increase, and you want your health care. And they said, okay, passed 90 to 10. And so for a very short period of time, you didn't pay anything for health care. First dollar health care, which is the same contract the UAW had at that time. Paid $1 for a prescription, for example. You got a little kid, and you pay $1 for a prescription? That's crazy. All right. So at that point, I decided, okay, I got to finish this. Then John Visser is over there in the ad building at Ball State.
Over there gesturing at the Ball State Administration building,
right, yeah.
Working for Jack Emmons.
Working for Jack Emmons.
And Emmons had come from Michigan, had he not?
Emmons came from Jackson.
Jackson.
Yeah, he's from Jackson, Michigan. And so he and John Visser got along really well. John was teaching, he was also teaching some history classes here.
We should mention that Emmons is the president of Ball State University at this point. Yes,
the great Jack Emmons, the person who's responsible for the Ball State healthcare program, and a wonderful man. We'll fast forward to that later when I spent some time with him after he retired and was down in the original honors house. But I came back here, and John Visser called me up and said, hey, this is now probably late June, early July. How you doing up there at Grand Rapids Junior College? It's okay, but I got to finish my degree. He says, I got a deal for you. He said, why don't you come down here and join the history faculty at Ball State? I said, why would I want to do that? He said, well, we had a couple of resignations, late in the year. One was a guy who went up to teach in Canada, I recall. I can't recall his name right now. A French historian named Jacques Couture. I said, well, okay, yeah, I'll come down there. So I was interviewed by Dick Caldemeyer, Everett Farrell, Dwight Hoover, Bob Houston. I can't think of any others. And so I said, okay, I'll come down there and teach. So I came down there for a year. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. I just came down there because it was something to do. And Everett Farrell gave me, I taught 4, we were on quarters then, as you are aware, we were out in quarters at one time. And so I taught, typical U.S. in the 20th century survey kind of stuff. And it gave me time to do a lot of research and writing on my doctoral dissertation. And so I came down here, and Everett Farrell said, if I got a deal for you, I'll give you one preparation.
Farrell would have been the chair of the
right.
Was it social sciences department then?
No, that was history.
It was history already, okay.
Ball State had become a university a couple of years previous. So came down here, taught America in the 20th century, and got almost everything written for my doctoral dissertation. And then the chair of the department at Hope called me and said, we had 2 guys leave, got to hire 2 new American historians. Why don't you come up here and talk to the group? They all know who you are. So job, Grand Rapids Junior College, because I knew this person. Job at Ball State, I knew this person. Job at Hope, I knew the department head who had been a faculty member when I was there. Mm-hmm. I went back to Hope. And this is an important point, because going back to Hope at that juncture, I thought that's probably where I'd spend the rest of my life. And so I went back there, joined the history faculty. The other young American historian, there were two of us, was a guy who just finished his degree, largely American legal history at Wayne State. And we taught all the American history. They had 5 people in the department. We were the 2 American history guys. And what happened there is that Hope went through what every university or college goes through at some point in time. The president was a person they had brought there who was a real research-oriented scholar from Kansas, but a Hope graduate. And he was trying to change the ship, shall we say, to more teacher-scholar than just teach. And a lot of the faculty mentors I had there were part of the old guard, and they were teachers. They had never published anything, and all they did was teach, and they were very successful at doing that. He wanted it to be more like we've become. Keep in mind, the Ball State faculty I joined was just like that. And so I said, I don't know if it's going to really work out too well. So I was kind of caught between the president, who'd hired me, and saw me as teacher-scholar, write articles, do great teaching. And my mentors there, who said, what's this publishing articles? Why should we have to do that to get tenure? That's ridiculous. So there was this big split occurring in the Hope College faculty, and I thought, I got to get out of Dodge. And so Everett Farrell, who was still the chair here, knew that I was interested in coming back. And what he wanted me to do, and this is really pivotal, he said, I'll tell you what I really want you to do. I want you to come back here and just teach. You're going to love this one because we ain't got it anymore. I want you to teach in the doctoral program. And so Ball State at that point had this doctoral program in American history.
Was it not, strictly speaking, in social sciences?
It was, but the part I had in it was American social intellectual history with Dwight Hoover, because it was a funny doctoral program. You may not have ever heard this. Every student doing any doctoral degree in any department at the university, there were about 5 departments who were offering doctorates, had to take American social and intellectual history. So most of the students in my class weren't just the history students. They were in English or teachers college or something like that. Dwight taught half of them. I taught the other half. So Dr. Farrell said to me, if you come back here, you can just teach that. And I said, okay, 1 preparation, 3 classes, all graduate students, never saw an undergraduate. So I don't, when I've been here before, I was teaching undergraduates in classes of maybe 50, 60, came back here, had classes of 13. And they were all graduate students, and all pretty good graduate students. So that was a lure to get me back here. And so getting me back here to work with Dwight and to teach History 611, Social and Intellectual History, American Social and Intellectual History, that was the beginning of getting back here. And that is the bridge that eventually gets me to the honors program. Mm-hmm. Because one of the students in one of those classes was Vic Lawhead's graduate assistant. And Vic was not happy with the work of Sandy McGibbon, who was my predecessor, English professor in the honors program. And he said, the guy's name is Ron Galbraith. He said, Ron, I wish I could find another honors director. And Ron Galbraith said to him, you should talk to Warren VanderHill. And so that's how I got an invite to go to the ad building, second floor.
Be the administration building.
Administration building, and to sit down with Victor B. Lawhead, who was Dean of Undergraduate Programs. And Vic said to me, I'd like to talk to you about becoming director of the honors program. And I said, what's that? That's where we were.
So forgive me for an inside baseball question before we develop this next thread. Some history departments look at American studies and it's what the hell is that?
Yeah.
Ball State and Hope evidently didn't think that American studies degree, given that you were doing historically oriented work, was anything but an American history doctorate.
I agree.
You never experienced any sort of lesser than, wondering if American studies was as rigorous or as good as an American history doctorate?
I don't know about the good as. No, not really. I mean, I'm going back to the kind of perfunctory interviews that I had with people down here. And, I think of, Doyle having worked with Stowe Persons at Iowa and Bob Houston having worked with several of the all-stars at UW-Madison. Nobody ever seemed to take that too seriously. I can recall when I convinced my friend Paul Mitchell to come here from Southern Methodist to join the faculty. somebody tongue-in-cheek sort of said, "Oh, has he got one of those degrees like you've got?" I said, "Yeah, that's fine." So I mean, no, there wasn't. I know what you're trying to get at, and I know of some departments where that became a really big issue, because they had American Studies department and history was over here, and American Studies was here, and I can recall Mike McGifford talking about that. This crossing this line, which was really more American literature and American history. It wasn't, say, well, there's too much political science, or there's too much geography. I took classes in that when I was in graduate school, but no one seemed to care that much.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was also the period of time where the myth and symbol school
I couldn't agree more.
approach was
Yep.
running rampant. And as you said, American literature was one of the well springs of the American Studies movement. History was the other, and then all of the other disciplines sort of filled in, architecture, art, etc.
Yeah, I would agree with that, yeah.
Okay, so we've gotten you back here to Ball State. This is the year 1965?
No, it's the second, like 67, 68.
67, 68, okay. And you're one prep, all graduate students.
Right.
Graduate students that you seem to have a very high regard for, despite the fact that doctoral education in the history of Ball State tended to rest on top of the teachers' college, interested in turning out the next generation of superintendents. They needed an advanced degree.
Not these guys, not the people that were in our program.
Speak to that.
These were people who had almost entirely been high school history teachers, or there were a few that came directly out of an undergraduate program, but they really ended up, in most cases, teaching at places like, Indiana Wesleyan, Taylor. A couple went to the state schools in the South, the branches of Kent State. I mean, that became a real issue, because then later, when Jim Cook was provost and I was associate provost, he killed the program. And part of it was that we were, particularly in Jim Cook's view, turning out people who weren't getting jobs, at least not jobs that he thought were worth anything. And it was a funny period in Ball State's history. But the people I remember who were in the program, and many of them were really first-class students, those are the kinds of places they wanted to go to. They were high school teachers. In other states, they might have been in community colleges. Of course, there was no community college system in Indiana at that time. And so a lot of them wanted to go to community colleges. I mean, what they really wanted to do was get beyond K-12. Some of them did become administrators of one kind or another, and some of them went on to places like the University of Nebraska at Omaha, some fairly good institutions, but it was more a credentialing experience. And a lot of them did dissertations that were based on local stuff.
I remember there used to be in this very room a short shelf of doctoral dissertations from that era, and one of the longest was on minor league baseball teams of Middletown.
Well, I'll tell you something. Dwight, this is a whole other piece of this history. I mean, Dwight was just an incredible mentor for so many of these people, and he had a doctoral student named Marilyn Domer, who'd been a social worker, a very good social worker, and she did one of the best of these dissertations, which was on community fundraising in Muncie, which was the beginning of the United Way. I mean, that's a really first-class piece of work. And there's some other ones, like one of my students was a guy who ended up as the dean of the School of Social Work at the University of Kentucky, named John Landon, who was a church organist, pretty well-known one. And he did one that was published as a book. I still remember the title, Jesse Crawford, the Giant of the Mighty Wurlitzer, or something like that. And that's a great American Studies topic. So there are these little bits and pieces of my students and Dwight's students who ended up doing some really good work. I brought some students down here with me from Hope.
Well, Bruce Galehood among them.
Well, Bruce was of a second group. There were two or three before him. One's a guy named Mike Barnes, who taught at Penn State, Erie for quite a while. And there was another one, Charlie Postma, who taught at Ohio Northern and then became a very successful realtor. So they were Hope students. These were not my Hope students who were going to go to Ann Arbor. These are my Hope students who wanted to get a degree and say, let's go to Ball State, because Warren's down there. So there were 4 or 5 like that. And they were pretty typical of the kind of students we had. They were good students. They worked hard, did good doctoral dissertations. I had a couple of them that did Dutch immigration stuff for me, because see, the part of the hook here of just teaching that one class was to have some time to get my dissertation into form to publish that, and then to get on to some other topics that I was interested in. And that's a very short period of time. I thought that would be a very long period of time, but it was a short period of time because it was a short period of time before it became the head of the honors program.
Was the course on American intellectual and cultural history new that you had brought to it, or was that already part of Dwight's?
Yeah, I've been here quite a while.
Okay. And it was in the 1950s, as I recall, with Merle Curdy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with whom I studied very briefly in his twilight years, who helped to lay the foundations of the intellectual history. Cultural history has sort of gone off on its own to become a field. Don't hear as much about intellectual history today anymore. All of us are cultural historians, whether we like it or not, let's say. But back then, those two things were sort of two twisted threads. And how was it that Ball State decided that there would be essentially like a core to graduate study? No matter what you were working on as a doctorate, you had to take that course. How did that evolve?
I don't know. I inherited that.
Okay.
I mean, Dwight was doing the class.
Had it gone back to the Teachers College days?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, because these degrees...
So it was pre-mid-60s.
Yeah, the degrees began... they were here when I first came here for that 1 year.
But I mean the course requirement that all
that everybody had to take the same
doctoral
class?
students took that course.
Oh, no, this is more political. It's when Ball State divided up the spoils of a teacher's college becoming a university.
The subject matter experts and the methods people sort of diverged.
Yeah, everybody's going to have a piece. And so if all the doctoral students in teacher's college or in social science or any other area of the university, what are you going to say is their core? What's their core?
But the idea that there would be a core.
That I don't know.
That would be across disciplines.
I have no idea where that came from. It was more that history has this stake, and our stake is going to be History 611, which is social and intellectual history.
You didn't see anything like that at Denver, I'm assuming. That there was a course that everybody took, no matter what their doctoral program.
Well, I made the course into kind of an introduction to American studies. So, yeah, it was, you could teach what you wanted. When you say, was there a curriculum for it? No, it's not like today, you can do what you want. No.
You have put your finger on something that I see as a recurring theme from this era. One is that as Ball State moves from a teacher's college to a university, it's scrappy. It's trying to establish itself.
Yeah.
It's got a little bit of a chip on its shoulder because it's not getting the support from the state that, say, Indiana University or Purdue is. It's not a flagship, never will be. They'll make sure that never happens. At the same time, there's forgive me, and I would like you to comment on this, almost a kind of benign neglect in which, as long as you were sort of competent in doing basically what you want, there was a hands-off policy, and that allowed people such as yourself to kind of innovate and flourish without a great deal of oversight, telling you what you could do and couldn't do.
True.
There's no assessment regime such as you would see in the later decades that says, no, you cannot do that.
Yeah, and I think that's eventually we get to the point. It's what are you going to do with honors education? Well, if this is a good idea, let's try that. If that's not a good idea, try something else. And it also gives you an openness to a lot of ideas from students. A lot of things that happen that you'll see eventually with honors program when it begins is there's suggestions that come from students. But going back to this, I think that's probably true. I think that with a teacher's college, you have to do these things to prepare people to get teaching licenses.
It's the
whole
method.
Licensure. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
But with this, as far as the doctoral program, that was born anew. And so you could pretty much within it do a lot of what you wanted to do. The only thing that was probably atypical about it, as you discovered looking at these manuscripts that were in here, copies of old dissertations, is that you had a lot of reliance on let's get the degree done.
Box checking, essentially.
And that meant let's do a lot of stuff that's sort of minor league players in Muncie or something like that, or something that was much more reputable. certainly I think, like the importance of some of the work that was done that focused on the Lynn's Middletown studies, like community fundraising, beginning of community fundraising in Muncie. Well, or Jesse Crawford, the giant of the mighty Wurlitzer. I mean, but see, the point I'm trying to emphasize here is those are ideas that the students, because of their own backgrounds, brought to the doctoral program and said, okay, I'm going to do this program and I've got an idea for this doctoral topic. What do you think? Well, if you're trying to do the IU, they would have thrown you out. What? You're not going to do something like that. Well, here, there was indeed this edginess, if you will. There was this openness. And Dwight and I were pretty accommodating, as far as we let people do, in the sense of fulfilling the requirement of demonstrating that you can do research in primary source materials and write with something that's relatively coherent. So we'd go ahead and do that. Yet the overlay of all this was just like all of us had experienced, whether it was at Iowa or at Denver or at Yale. You still had, exams and defense of the dissertation and all that kind of stuff.
There was a reputation that still lingered at the point that I came in 1996, in which people would jokingly refer to Ball State as being high school with ashtrays, meaning that for the undergraduate experience, it wasn't a lot more rigorous than you would have found in high school, but you could smoke, which you couldn't do in your high schools.
Right.
And
that wasn't true at St. Paul's, by the way. St. Paul's had a smoking room, but you had to have permission from your parents. That is true. Yeah.
Over time, there was a response, I'd like you to comment on this, that as Ball State proved to be able to attract faculty who did doctorates at research universities to come here, which hadn't been seen quite so much in previous decades, and they brought with them new ideas and a new spirit, and perhaps more of an emphasis, like Dwight, on the teacher-scholar model, emphasizing the scholarship on an equal par with the teaching part.
Yeah, that's right.
Was there a tension within the older part of Ball State that had carried over, resistant to this notion of allowing these scholar teachers that they brought in to make changes?
Yeah, that's the sea change of the 1980s. I mean, Jim Cook, during his short time here, 4+ years as provost, is the real agent provocateur. I mean, he was provost, along with Bob Bell and the board saying, go get him, Jim, who changed the requirements for what it took to attain tenure and to be promoted to associate or full professor. I mean, that's it. I mean, with me and people who came after, it's been, playing around with it. I mean, Jim's view was scholar-teacher. We laugh a lot because we maintain our long friendship. I said, well, I made it more teacher-scholar. But the point is, you had to do it. And so the change begins in the 1980s in the lives of faculty, where you are not going to get tenure, you are not going to be promoted to associate or full professor unless you can demonstrate an ongoing program of scholarly productivity, in addition to being a classroom teacher who can do something other than stumble around the classroom. So you'll see a little thing on there that for a couple of years I was in charge of, I was coordinator of faculty evaluation, something that Rich Burkhart asked me to do to try to bring in. That's
when Rich Burkhart was acting president?
No, when he was provost. Well,
provost.
He didn't have the title. He was vice president for academic affairs, so he was in that position. And we decided we were going to do required faculty evaluations. And that's another story we'll get to eventually, because the honors program plays a real lead role in that, because they were the first ones out of the box to say, okay, we'll do it. Because part of it was, it's crap, doesn't mean anything, it's just a popularity contest. And now you say you want to let the students look at this, and you want to have this put forward for my tenure, or for promotion, or then we put in merit pay with Cook during that period as well. That was never true up till that point in Ball State's history either.
Was the it in that sentence the honors program?
Yeah, I mean, it was the honors program saying, okay, we have all these honors students, several hundred of them, and you want to teach an honors class? Okay. Then you have to agree to let them evaluate you.
And you were in charge of that?
Yeah.
Were you the first one?
Yes.
To do that? Okay, so you had to
and also, we are going to collect these and put them on a file in the Honors College office, and anyone can look at them.
Any administrator?
Student, administrator,
Student, fact.
custodian. Yeah, I remember having that conversation with a faculty member who said, well, I guess I don't want to teach. And I said, I guess you don't. And so that became sine qua non for somebody who wanted to teach an honors class. And most people,
Now, these were peer evaluations you conduct, not student course
no, they're
evaluations.
student evaluations.
Oh,
They were
student course evaluations.
They weren't peer evaluations.
Before
We
there were
didn't do any
student
peer.
course evaluations throughout the university, they were in
There
the
were no course evaluations. throughout
except in the
university.
honors program later Honors College.
We pioneered it and said, okay, I am the honors director. I am the person who is in charge of trying to convince everybody on the campus they should have student evaluations in their classes. Oh, well, we're not going to do that. All right, then we'll do it in the honors program. So the honors program will pioneer that.
What year would that have been, Warren?
Oh, it was probably, I don't know, would have been early, probably sometime in the 70s, I would think. I'm
So
not really
before
sure.
it moved from honors program to honors college in 79.
Yeah, because we had done it. And so there was only one academic entity on the whole campus that required that students have, like my word, the right to evaluate the person instructing them. So we came up with a form. Student Honors Council approved it. Faculty Honors Council, that's so fine. But the big Rubicon to cross here was when I said, okay, but if we're going to do it, anybody can see it. What do you mean anybody? Well, my department head? Yep. If he or she wants to. Oh, okay. Well, can I use it to put forward with my P&T documents? Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, that's fine. Well, okay. But anybody can come in off the street and say, I'd like to see Joe Smith's evaluations in Honors Humanities 2 last semester. I said, yeah, that's fine. Now, I'm not so sure they do that now, but we did it more to make a statement, and I thought it was kind of funny.
They do not.
Oh, okay.
Privacy.
Yeah. Oh, that's right, I forgot, because now you got different kind of requirements. But let's say for the entire time I was in charge of honors, and probably on through Arno Wittig, maybe into the early years of Jim Rubel as dean, this was bragged about as being an open file. And I actually, I'll turn it on its head. I had faculty members who would come to the honors office and want to see the SAT scores of their students. They'd say, I want to see the verbal SAT scores of these kids in my class. Okay, that's fine, you can do that. So, I mean, it did cut the other way, but to have access to student opinions about your ability as a classroom teacher was a sea change in the history of this institution. Absolute sea change. Now you got to put all this forward, 5 barrel loads of stuff to be considered for this, that, or the other thing. You got to have, post-tenure review, or you've got to have outside people, with expertise writing about how great you are. Well, we didn't go quite that far, but this really is the beginning. This is a seed that really begins all of this, because it was at a university where no one officially evaluated anyone for what was pretty much automatic salary increases. Well, it was automatic salary increases, and pretty much automatic promotion to full professor, to associate professor and full professor. That's just, how do you get to be a full professor at Ball State when I came here? Mm-hmm. Oh, with the passage of time. Oh, okay, that sounds good. Well, in my case, I happened to be doing a lot of interesting stuff, and there was a university promotion and tenure committee, so I went from assistant to associate professor in 5 years. Well, nobody does that. But at that point in time, you could do that if you're doing some things. And truth be told, you had someone like Dwight Hoover who was on the University Promotion and Tenure Committee, so this guy's a really good guy. So it was like passing out the badges, we'll take this guy, you get that guy. There was always a number. How many promotions are we going to allow in the whole university this year? So you had to get your guy in the front door. So it was none of the stuff that you have to go through now. I mean, now it's just mountains and mountains and mountains of stuff. Well, we digress. So.
No, it's not a digression at all. It's an integral part of the story.
It isn't. For me, it is, particularly because I became provost, and a lot of these things began to come online that then, after I retired, became even more important in the history of the institution.
You make a point that I find utterly fascinating, because as a specialist in the Vietnam War era, my understanding is the movement for accountability and relevance in the curriculum was partly driven by campus protests, in which students demanded the right, use that term, to evaluate their faculty members so that there was accountability, not just to the provost or the deans or chairs, but to the students. And it was an idea that I link up to the history of the universities back in the medieval period, when it was the students that hired the faculty, and would convene in a tavern, and the faculty worked at the pleasure of the students. And so it was almost a return to this turning things upside down. But here, the idea of evaluation was not driven by students at all, even though this is the decade after they began to be phased in universities.
This wasn't Madison, Wisconsin, or Cal Berkeley. The demand here, I can guarantee you, never really came from the students. I mean, I'm not going to say within the honors program, which is the one part of it I know, this was never any, you got to do this. It was more, Student Honors Council would say, I mean, it would be a good idea if we had the opportunity. I mean, it's this kind of language, this tone, to evaluate the faculty. Yeah, this seems like a good idea.
It sounds collegial.
It was, very much so. And it really wasn't done, as I look back and try to be fair about this, with any great angst. I mean, a lot of the faculty who were teaching were people like Tony Edmonds and John Barber and Joe Trimmer. They were great teachers. They didn't care. They knew they were going to get good evaluations. I mean, the evaluations of honors college faculty during the 15 years I worked with honors were really very, very good. They were among some of the best faculty in this institution. And so they weren't people who worried about this. This might hold up my tenure. So, no, it's not going to hold up your tenure.
So the part of this that connects to the history that I'm aware of is that it was an idea that kind of, as you were mentioning, this in the context of there were things that were driven by the students' interest and curiosity, that there was faculty openness to.
Yeah, young faculty.
And
because most of the faculty,
it was sort of like, well, let's try this, an openness to experimentation.
Most of the faculty teaching honors then were young faculty. I mean, a lot of the older faculty didn't want to bother with this. You didn't want to teach a new preparation or something like that. And the younger faculty just loved the fact they were going to have a class of 20 honor students. So it was
reduced class size, and that they might be better prepared students than the general population.
And so that it wasn't hard to sell an honors class in those days because there were a lot of young faculty, especially in the English department, who were, they were relegated to teaching freshman composition at a school that had virtually no admission standards, and so you're teaching to people who don't know what a verb is, and I mean I can teach 15 honor students rather than teach them. And so they really thought that was a terrific idea. And then you began to get faculty like the Tony Edmondses and the Joanne Edmondses and the Joe Trimmers, who really identified a lot with Honors College and with those students. And they began to mold and shape their own careers on teaching that cohort of undergraduates.
You've touched on an aspect of Ball State history that I'd like to solicit just a little bit more from you about, and that has to do with a comment you made earlier, correctly observing that although all of the surrounding states had community college systems that came into place in the 60s and 70s, Indiana was resistant to that idea. I understand Indiana University was part of the, blocking this, and that eventually the branch campuses kind of grew out that they would do community college-like activities and funnel people into IU or Purdue after that. But that the Indiana States, the University of Southern Indiana and Ball State were considered essentially de facto hybrids between community colleges and actual universities. And so open admissions meant that one had to graduate in the top, 20% or 50% of their high school class. Presumably most were coming from a 60-mile radius of Muncie. And so you had people that were not coming in with a true 12-year education through high school. They might have been more close to 9th grade, 10th grade in terms of their ability to read and write and figure.
That's true.
So you were here as Ball State was had just made the transition from the Teachers College to the university, and is trying to up the standards to a certain extent, but also has to keep enough students here to be able to support things tuition-wise.
Well, they weren't trying to up the standards when I first came here, as far as undergraduate enrollment is concerned. Ball State liked to have itself listed in college guides as, I'll never forget this phrase, somewhat selective.
Somewhat selective.
And somewhat selective, by contrast with Yale, extremely selective. Somewhat selective could be defined as you might not get in the fall quarter, but if you wait a while, you could get in the winter, and if you wait longer, you can get in the spring. Now
So because there were like quotas for most people played in the fall?
No, it's dorms.
Oh, it's the dorms?
Yeah, that regulated the size of the class.
The fall ones would flunk out, and then there would be more room. They had beds. They would let people in.
It
Sounds like a hotel industry.
Well, it was, hotbed. It was called deferred admission. So you could apply to Ball State, and if you were a really crummy high school student, you would get a letter that said you cannot come in the fall, but you may be able to come in the winter. And if you still had not been able to come in the winter, you could come in the spring. That's the trade-off of not having what they had all around us and throughout the United States, community colleges. And so it wasn't that you couldn't go on to a form of public post-secondary education, it's you might have to wait. And that's what happened at Ball State, so that you got students in the winter intake and the spring intake that in many cases really shouldn't have been in college anyway, and should have been at the Community College of Indiana, because I was provost when that came into being. And that was the way that the state wanted it to be played out. You are right when you say IU and Purdue had no interest in having community colleges. What they said was, okay, we will build branch campuses, and you will have one in Richmond, and we'll have one here, there, and everywhere, not envisioning that IUPUI was going to become what it has become, the real University of Indianapolis, as I call it. Or City University of Indianapolis with the med school and all that. So they just simply said, we'll divide up these campuses in the rest of the state. And Jack Emmons, who was the president here, I can't recall the name of the president of the United States at that point in time, said, well, we don't really have any interest in doing that. And so that's why they bailed on it. They didn't have any reason to say we want to have a Ball State branch in, I don't know, Kokomo, since IU's got one there anyway. And that's the way this whole thing played out, which I thought was nuts. I mean, I came down here from a very fine, old, well thought out community college system in the state of Michigan, where a lot of these were just linked in with the K-12 system, and it was seamless. A lot of them had community college districts, but very mature, very good. I came down here, and no one knew what these places were. And until the late 1990s, when they began to Stan Jones, the old Ivy Tech guy, decided we should have this for some very good reasons, and without a lot of discussion and debate, said we're going to wave the magic wand, and the Ivy Tech campuses are going to become community colleges. Now go drive downtown here. You have growth in this place with the dorms out here and the health of this. The other big growth is downtown. What is it? Community college. If you'd said that to me 30 years ago, I would have said, no, we're not going to build any big new buildings downtown Muncie. They're going to be community college buildings. So that's where we are. And this all takes strange turns for a variety of reasons. In higher education with IU and Purdue was a lot that they just didn't want to get involved in building more residence halls in West Lafayette and Bloomington. And so they had to find, where are we going to put these students? Now, of course, it's the other side, because the enrollment numbers are going down, both at Ivy Tech and in the bigger numbers. And we don't have an out-of-state spigot or an international spigot that we can play around with, as all the schools where you've been have. I mean, you go to my son and daughter-in-law at UW-Madison, that's what they're going through. We can turn this out-of-state spigot, we can turn this, the international spigot, because there's great demand to go to an IU, Bloomington, or Purdue, West Lafayette, or to go to UW-Madison.
Well, going back to your arrival at Ball State and this singular opportunity to have one prep, teach graduate students only, have great colleagues like Ed Farrell and Dwight Hoover. And I'm curious about the tension that may have existed between the open enrollment reality and the aspirations among the scholar-teacher, teacher-scholar types that are the young faculty, as you mentioned, that are really interested in doing something more and see potential. So how did that play out?
Well, it didn't really play out much until the early 80s with Jim Cook, because there was no reward for doing it. Dwight is the real atypical faculty member in this department, because Dwight did what Dwight did in becoming a well-known national scholar because he thought that's what historians did. That's a really important point. And even though all of his other American history colleagues weren't publishing so much as a book review, Dwight thought it was really important to get his work into good journals like the American Quarterly and to go to national meetings and give papers.
And to write books, monographs.
And to do what scholars trained by someone like Stowe Persons at the University of Iowa did. Now, this is nothing negative about Phyllis Uhas, but she'd also worked with Stowe Persons. But she liked international education and doing a lot of other stuff and had great personal wealth. But she had no interest in publishing articles and books. So Dwight was the only, I mean the only senior faculty member in a department of a couple dozen people who was that kind of role model for people like me. And so when people like me come here and some of the other younger faculty, and we look at someone like Dwight, my background was that that's what you did. You did aspire to publish books, articles, etc., to inform your teaching and to make you better prepared in the classroom. We all believe in that. But the senior faculty here at that time, they were really, as I tried to explain to somebody the other day, they were World War II veterans who got doctoral degrees in history and were teaching beyond a high school. I mean, this was a really good life because they weren't required to do anything. They taught their classes, they drank martinis on Friday afternoon, and they had a good life. And they had good salaries, and they were promoted and tenured automatically. Now, that's a pretty good gig. So when change comes in the early 1980s, these people are all on the verge of retirement anyway, and so it's the younger faculty coming up, my generation and the ones that come after, one's plural, they were just different kind of people. They were people who thought that what you ought to do is what Dwight Hoover had been doing his entire life. And there were other people who were doing, and they were doing it even more as far as the stuff of what their academic existence was like.
Were there other departments on campus that adopted that turn? Was history perhaps alone? Did English join in this?
I think there's certainly English did. I think poli-sci probably did. I mean, of the ones I'm aware of, because I was here eventually as provost kind of overseeing all of this, I think all of them by the late 1980s and early 90s had become teacher-scholar based. But by that point, people were not going to get tenured or promoted to the senior ranks unless they had evidence of doing things that were scholarly and of having a successfully demonstrated their classroom ability. I think that's true.
We have just about 10 minutes before the end of this first interview. We'll do a follow-up interview next week at the same time. And what my hope was to get to the point where you were asked to take over the honors program at the end of its second decade.
Right.
You mentioned that you moved very rapidly from assistant to associate. You got promotion, you got tenured.
Yeah.
How was it that you got marked out for potential in administration? Who was responsible for that? And how was it that you were open to doing that, especially since you were interested in scholarship?
Well, I don't think there isn't any formality to it. I go back to the point that I mentioned in this history class I was teaching, social and intellectual history. Vic Lawhead's graduate assistant, Ron Galbraith, was in that class, and Vic was looking for someone else to be in charge of the honors program. And Ron and I had got to know each other pretty well. He knew that I was going to Hope College. In fact, he said that to Vic, Vic, you went to DePaul, this guy went to Hope, it's kind of like what you're looking for. Small liberal arts college background as far as running honors. Why don't you talk to him? I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, there isn't anything where you could formally say, well, we think this guy might have some potential in administration. I didn't know what administration was.
Well, had you been elected to university committees?
No,
had you marked yourself out for?
No.
Nothing like that.
Zero. No, I was teaching. I was a teacher scholar. And it's just that at that point in time, Vic just wanted to talk to somebody. I don't know, maybe he talked to 5 other people. I have no idea, never asked him. And we hit it off. And he said, well, it was really phrased like this. Well, how'd you like to give this a try? And I said, well, okay. What do you do? Well, you're in charge of this, that, and the other thing, and you got to monitor these classes, and you've got a secretary. I remember him saying to me, do you know enough about administration to keep a secretary busy? I said, well, I guess we'll find out. And then in the summer, rather than teach classes in the summer, taught History 611 in the summer too, you go to orientation and you give a spiel about how honors program is great and wonderful, and all these students admitted here in the distinction category, they're eligible to be in the honors program if they want to.
Oh, there was a category admitted with distinction.
Yeah, upper 20% of the freshman class based on class rank and test score. Yeah.
I see.
So any distinction admit was eligible if he or she wished to participate in the honors program as a first quarter freshman.
Okay.
And then I went to orientation with an honors student, and I gave a faculty spiel, and the student gave a student spiel, and then they had to fill out these little cards. Do I accept this invitation or do I decline? Yeah, that was the whole deal. And usually...
No interview.
No, we ran about 80% of the kids at orientation. They're right there and they got, what, to decide now? Yeah, right now. Fill out the card. So, and later there were a few that would come to me and say, well, I said no, but now I want to say yes. Yeah, that's fine. But it was just try it, see if you like it. It's a different approach to education. You're going to take this humanities class, you're going to take some honors sections of regular general studies classes, which you have to take anyway. And that was pretty much it. Give it a shot. Try it out. It was the honors try. And so I said, okay, that's fine. We'll go ahead and do that. And so I went back to Everett Farrell and I said, Dean Lawhead would like me to take a look at this opportunity. And so he said to me, okay, you go back to him and tell him you'll try it for a couple of years. Went back to Lawhead and said, okay, the head of the department, of my department, said, I can give us a shot for a couple of years. I talked to Dwight and a few other people, and they said, yeah, it's a nice gig. You're around a lot of kids like the kids you'd have, Hope students and things like that. So yeah, nobody said don't do it. They said, yeah, give it a try. And it was sort of like, putting your toe into the waters of administration. It wasn't heavy administration, I can guarantee you. So that's when I said, okay, I'll do it. That's the beginning.
So you come from a line of entrepreneurs, right. And you maybe had a knack for marketing, because essentially you have to go to orientation and kind of sell this thing.
I'm good at that.
How did you even know what you were selling? You didn't really come from an honors background.
Well, I was selling liberal arts education. I mean, what I was trying to sell was
at a former teacher's college that didn't have that liberal arts core.
Right. And what I was trying to say, even though you might want to major in architecture or you're going to major in accounting, this is a good thing to have on your record. It goes on your diploma. Later we created things like our own diplomas and stuff like that, but at this point it was indicated on your transcript that you were in the honors program. So there were a few little bennies like that. Another was that you got to register for classes first. So when seniors were registering, so were the honor students. You had the same book borrowing privileges as graduate students. You could take books out for a whole year. Oh, that's a pretty good deal. So that I didn't do that. That preceded me. So there were a couple little teeny perks in this thing. And the faculty that teach these honors classes are really good faculty. So it was basically going to orientation, and I had a 25-minute canned spiel and trying to convince the student and mommy and daddy, or mommy, daddy might not have been there, or daddy might have been, mommy wasn't. Why don't you give this a shot? But there was very, very, very little pre-orientation contact. So there was a lot of, what's the honors program? That was the beauty of having a student with me. And some of them were just great because they had really enjoyed the experience. They were very articulate, very persuasive. And the bottom line was, what do you have to lose? You got to take general studies anyway. So all you're going to do is sign up for an honors class. If you like it, fine. You don't like it, that's fine too. That was honors.
I think this would be a good place to stop the interview, and we will resume a week from today.
Fine. Sounds good. Enjoy it very much.
Thank you very much.